Sitting now.
Hello there, welcome to episode 66, the appropriately numbered episode 66 of Right Where You're Sitting Now. I'm Ken. Joining me in the co-pilot seat once again is Marck Satyr. How are you, sir?
In the sidecar.
The sidecar.
That's what I get reduced to. The sidecar.
Sidecar. Yeah, I imagine you have one of those hats with, you know,
Exactly.
with the goggles on. And
Exactly.
Anyway, so we are back and we are covering a topic. I guess you could say we've kind of brushed over this topic a little bit with Carl Abrahamson recently, but generally, we've certainly mentioned things like the left-hand path before, but we've never really gone in any depth into it on the show, and so we're addressing that today with author Don Webb. So Mark, give us a bit of a breakdown of what we're going to be expecting today.
Well, Ken, me and Ken, our sandaled and weary feet have taken us to the ultimate edges of the land, the dark and mysterious Egyptians. And crouching on the Nile is the guardian of the mysteries, the Sphinx herself, because we are approaching the sanctuary of the god Set, or sometimes referred to as Sutek the Destroyer, even. Yes. So no less than the adversary figure from the Egyptian pantheon there.
And we're going to be talking with Don about his book Overthrowing the Old Gods, which is interesting because it's a different order looking at another order's kind of primary text. So it should be quite interesting to kind of delve into that. Yeah,
adding some refreshing light to it. Also, it's worth mentioning this is the 66th episode, and if you're so minded, if you add all the numbers from 1 to 11, they add to 66, and so it's often used as an emblem of magic.
There you go.
Which is something which, funny enough, is touched on in that at least the number 11 and its relationship to the letter K and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, all the best people start with the letter K. Let's be honest about it. Anyway, let's cut over to Don, and we'll see you on the other side. Hello, Don Webb. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a long time coming. And could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
Sure, no problem. I was born in 1960 on Walpurgis Nacht, but more to the point now, I am a fiction writer. I do horror fiction, science fiction. I've been doing that since about 1989. I also write books about occultism. I have written about the Greek magic papyri. I've written the book tonight we want to talk about, which is a book about Crowley. And I've written several books on phenomena called the left-hand path. Now, I found my way to the left-hand path in a sort of odd, roundabout way. I had, in my late 20s, decided I was not going to practice any form of occultism anymore, because literally everyone I met was in some way pretty mentally deficient. And buying an occult book at a bookstore, of course this is before Amazon and anonymous books, is more embarrassing than buying pornography. So I said, I'm going to put this stuff aside. I actually went out at this ceremony and said to the universe, look, if you want me, you got to send me a better teacher. This stuff is awful. And then for a couple of years, didn't do this at all. And one night, I had been researching the Salem witch trials, and I made a little chart of how thinking in Salem went really bad. I was very happy with my little chart and decided it was good for the evening and turned on the TV. And there was the Geraldo Rivera special on Satanism in America. And I started watching it, and I was, oh my God, it's exactly the same level of stupidity we had almost 300 years ago. Human beings are just not getting better. And toward the very end of the show, one of the occult investigators said, I have files on all these evil Satanists in America. And this really odd-looking guy said, well, why don't you arrest them if this is all true? And immediately Geraldo cut this guy's mic. You could actually hear the mic being cut on the set. And it was a guy named Michael Aquino. Well, I happened later that night to go out with some friends, and I said, I've never sent fan mail to anybody on TV in my entire life. But if I could send this guy fan mail, I would send him fan mail for making Geraldo Rivera shut up. I am so impressed. And one of my friends gave me a strong, kind of odd look and said, hey, I need you to drive me home. I said, okay, I was driving her home. And she said, so you want to send a letter to Dr. Aquino? Well, I noticed immediately she had said doctor, which had not been, in the TV show. And I said, yes. She said, well, I'm seeing him next week. If you write it and drop it off by my house, I'll take it. And suddenly I looked at this woman and her husband, Dr. Stephen Flowers, who is my primary initiator, who had never mentioned of their occult connections, didn't walk around wearing so much occult jewelry. They looked like a freak, and they all had real jobs and were really intelligent. So I sent off my letter, got back a letter, began some correspondence, and not only joined, 7 years later, I was the high priest. Very literally, I had put the task to the universe saying, look, if you want me to do this, send me an unmistakable sign. And it doesn't get more unmistakable than someone sitting in your car offering to carry a letter for you. During my time as high priest, I was high priest for 6 years. I was glad when someone else could take it over. Unlike most occult fraternities, the Temple of Set changes its leadership. It's not like, well, we've got the one guy or the one gal, and they'll run it for life, because it's kind of a pain in the butt to be an administrator. Since then, I've written quite a few books. Uncle Setnock's Essential Guide to the Left-Hand Path is probably my best-selling book, and I still find people, all these years later, well, it's almost 30 years later, that come to me and tell them that was the book that kind of opened their eyes. And since then, I divide my writing time between my fiction and my writing on the occult.
It was I read an interview of you a while ago, and wasn't it you were playing Dungeons and Dragons with people that
I was actually. It was a role-playing game. And at the time, of course, the joke was that role-playing games led you to Satanism, which in my case is absolutely true. But I think I'm probably the one person that found that rather odd path. Not that I would call the Temple of Set Satanism anymore. During the height of the Satanic Panic, when people were yelling about the dangers of Satanists and pointing fingers, we responded with, look, yeah, we're here. What's your problem? And then as soon as sort of that pressure went away, we were like, well, we have actually other things to do. And it doesn't sound nearly as sexy to say, well, we're a bunch of Neoplatonists with an Egyptian metaphor. Wow, that does not sound like recruiting material. But that probably would be a much better explanation of who we are.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that we've discussed this on other show. We've discussed it with Carl Abrahamson actually briefly. It feels at the moment like we might be heading into a new satanic panic. We know we've got a lot of movement from some less desirable groups like Order of Nine Angles, etc. Making mainstream news a lot of the time, and there appears to be, I don't know, it just feels a lot like it did in the 80s in terms of, the phrase, at least, Satanism, and the way it's been bandied around again. Have you noticed this yourself? Or?
Oh, no, I think you're absolutely correct. Usually in times of political, especially geopolitical stress, human beings look for groups that they can stigmatize. And the groups, particularly like the ONA, who have very little stake in the world, can get immediate press by coming out and saying anything. And so I think some of those tensions are going to reoccur. There's largely two approaches. There's the approach of that the Temple of Set uses, saying, here's our material, here's what we think, we'll talk to you. Or you can do the approach of being completely underground and silent. I think there are some groups that may be doing that well, but it's kind of hard to do well in the super media saturated world where we interact with each other through so many forms of electronic media every single hour.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting, I think a lot of people seem to think that the Temple of Set and the Church of Satan are kind of basically the same thing, but that's not the case, is it, in any way? I was wondering, could you talk about the kind of the Aquino split, as a lot of people call it, and the maybe talk about the Church of Satan, because we've just done an episode with Carl Abrahamson we've gone over quite a lot of the Church of Satan, but maybe quickly let's talk about kind of how the Temple of Set came about, and
maybe what are the distinct differences and what are the distinct.
Well, first off, I want to give you guys props for giving Carl Abrams a chance to speak. He's really brilliant, and he understands some of the deeper ideas in the Church of Satan that a lot of people who buy that label don't. The Church of Satan is not a spiritual development path. The Church of Satan is a path of realizing the hypocrisy of society, making fun of that hypocrisy, and then as you begin to break with the world, you will notice you have some powers and abilities, not particularly great, not superhero stuff, but some powers and abilities that come from just not being hypnotized all the time. And then the Church of Satan makes the very logical assumption that what you should do with those powers is further your power and your pleasure. Perfectly fine. You could even call that the imminent version of the left-hand path. We get results right here, right now. That's what we're focused on. The Temple of Set is more the transcendental branch of the left-hand path. We think that the purpose of life is, of course, as our satanic forebearers, first off, to break from the conditioning of the world, step away from the programming that hits us all the time, and then find out who we are. We think the process of finding out who we are, turning inward, is a key both to powers and maybe to self-deification. Now, in this, we're very Neoplatonic. We think, well, if I am an individual, what's the first form of the individual? What is the Platonic essence of that? And we think this is the entity that appears various times in human history, usually under different names, but most often under the Egyptian name of Set. We don't worship Set, which makes it a very hard thing for most pagans to grasp, because I have a pagan friend and they're having some problem. And said, well, could you pray to Set for me about this? And I said, no, I can't. And what would he do anyway? But I certainly can do my own magic for you. The break between Aquino and LaVey had seen that the path of the Church of Satan should be increasingly secular, should be more horizontal, should be people that are making a real change in the world, and that the sign of being a priest would be you make a lot of money and give some of it to the church. Aquino was like, well, we can do things for fundraising, but the priesthood is based on an actual experience of this entity, a noetic experience of this form. And Tom was basically, look, that's not anything I've ever talked about, and that's not what any of this is about, and I don't know what the hell you're doing. And then Aquino, of course, as always, when you have a schism, it's like, no, this has always been the truth. I think to a large extent that Michael Aquino was a very gifted philosopher, and that Satanism gave him a vocabulary and a methodology for waking up. that wasn't as pious as, say, what you might find in a fourth way group where you're doing it because you love God. I think loving the divine is something that happens toward the end of your spiritual journey instead of at the beginning of your spiritual journey.
Yes, that's sort of really intriguing. So there's a sort of, I've that's never been clear to me before, the difference between the two strands. The one sort of I'm not sure if the word mystical. Well, yeah, I don't know what you would how you would take that particular term, but I suppose it's a sort of mystical and one more sort of pragmatic or magical, I suppose.
Now, it so much depends on goals rather than means in magical practice, or well, actually in any kind of practice in the world. One could say that probably in the practice of plumbing. The tools and the methods may be the same. I could go today and sit in a very right-hand path Buddhist temple that's not far from where I'm at, and engage in meditation with the monks, and use it practically. If any camera were pointed at me, I'm doing the same things they are, but the goal is different. There's it's a big confusion in the occult world, because people always look at these different traditions and say, well, they must be the same because they do the same things. The way the mind gets to the place where it can affect itself and consequently reality are the same. There's a lot of different traditions, but it's the reason for the goal that separates groups.
So in terms of we obviously hear a lot about OTO and Golden Dawn practices, and what are the kind of, when you become a member of the Temple of Set, what's kind of expected of you? What's your kind of curriculum or day-to-day kind of practice?
It's a completely plug-and-play curriculum. Like, you can join the OTO, pull out Liber Resh. You've got, I've got to do these 4 things every day. Need to go to a Gnostic Mass occasionally, and I should probably read these books. The Temple of Set assumes that most of your training you probably have already done, that you have tried 2 or 3 or 4 things in the occult world, or 40 things in the occult world, and have begun to discover that reality that you experience is not the reality that the average sleeping human experiences. And then we provide a very simple model of magic and say, hey, keep doing what you're doing. Here's our thought and philosophy. What are your questions? And then we usually have a 2-year period where we exchange all sorts of communications about people trying to get their lives together and what we think and do. And if it's a good fit, people can stay. If it's a bad fit, people go on. And there's no shame, obviously, in going on. We see ourselves as a school rather than a movement. There are very few standard Setian practices. Probably the closest that comes is there is an invocation of Set that is used pretty often, that Michael Aquino had written back in 75, just because it's poetic and it also lays out a lot of principles in a really comprehensible way, both to the rational mind and to the part of your mind that is beyond reason, to the supra-rational mind, we might say.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking again, actually, returning to your very scholarly and engagingly scholarly, actually, book, Mr. Webb, the 7 Phases of Darkness, and that draws a lot on the sort of history, the iconography history, the mythology of the Set figure, and I assumed that part of engagement with the Temple of Set would be like developing a relationship in some sense with that archetype, or that having a comprehensive understanding of what it means, at least means to the individual.
Well, the interesting thing is that yes, we do expect that at a certain level of development, if you are called to this. The first level of the Temple of Set, the level of Setian, is you are an interested scholar. The second level, being an adept, means you have certain skill in magic and you're willing to accept as a working model of the universe the temple's model. There is a third level beyond that where you need to show that you have personal interactions with the said entity. We do actually see our priesthood as being sacred to and chosen to a certain extent by Set. And this is a matter that you can't give simple guidelines. It's not like, well, one day you'll have a dream, and in a dream you'll see a black pearl, and that means no. It means that certain changes happen in the way you perceive yourself, the cosmos, particularly the way you perceive the flow of time, that not only you can experience, but other people who have been through the process can experience. And from that, we have a priesthood, which has further levels of development. We are a child intellectually of the systems of the Golden Dawn or the OTO, although we, since we're not based on the Kabbalah, we don't have a 10-degree system, and we are less emphatic about what each degree should master, largely because, and this is what's always confused me in some ways about the OTO, is the Kabbalah is a wonderful and beautiful system if in fact you worship and understand the Hebrew God as the fundamental principle of the universe. If you begin by rejecting that, the Kabbalah seems like just a rather pointless code game, and you could probably find code games that are more fun. You could find code games in Lovecraft, or you could find code games in Herbert's Dune series or something, or make up your own that are just as valid as the Kabbalah.
Yeah, interesting. You were talking earlier, and I've heard you speak about this before, about the way you observe time when you're a member of the Temple of Set, and that seems pretty interesting. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, one of the greatest things that human beings did for themselves, or did to themselves, depending on your orientation, with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, we began to fetishize time as an objective reality. Because you got to, right? If you're going to have your factory workers start at 7:35 in the morning, you need them in the plant at 7:30. And you need them in the plant at 7:30 every day. You began to think of time in a completely Newtonian fashion. Newton gave us time as the one invariant in his system. Time is always going to be the same. Turns out Newton was wrong. Also, you will discover that not everything flows with the same kind of causality all of the time, at least in terms of subjective experience. Now, all humans know this to some extent, right? It's 10 minutes on your chair at the dentist may seem to last for hours, whereas an entire night with your lover may seem to be over in just a blink of the eye. We know that there's a relationship between emotion and duration, but the really fundamental breakthrough would be this. If I'm going to leave this slightly obese body that's talking to you through all the airwaves right now, and I'm going into a world of my own creation, duration is the key, not objective time. Or if I'm going to say that I am affecting things magically, I can do something in my chamber and it causes another human being somewhere on the planet to do something else, which would mean all kinds of like superliminal speeds of information, then I'd have to say, look, that's not linear time. I, as a spiritual being, am free from linear time. And after enough years of keeping that as an intellectual idea and as a practical idea for occult work, it slowly seeps into your being. And there's this moment where, I am living in at least a slightly different universe than all the humans around me. I wonder what else might be here where I am.
Yeah, that's interesting. We were talking about rituals earlier on, and one that popped up when I was doing some research was there was a Cthulhu ritual. And also, there's a connection with this Cthulhu ritual and Kenneth Grant, a kind of H.P. Lovecraft crossover period where it seemed to be Lovecraft's work was being kind of incorporated into magical work. I think it was 1972.
In 72, we had this interesting moment. And the interesting moment was it began on the Church of Satan side for reasons that are extraordinarily prosaic, but then went somewhere else. Anton LaVey had a 2-book deal with Avon Books. And Anton was never a writer. This was not his great goal in life. He usually got his girlfriends, partners at the time, through the typing and so forth. After writing the Satanic Bible, which is a really short book, a lot of white space in that book, he was in, Avon said, hey, this was a bestseller. We weren't expecting it to be. We want another book for you, and we'll send you, a quick sign, and we'll send you in advance. And like all of us in the writing field did that, didn't wonder what the hell he was going to do. When he came up with his first draft of rituals and sent it back to Avon, I said, this is way too short. You've got to find some more stuff here. And about that time, Michael Aquino was passing from the 3rd degree to the 4th degree in the Church of Satan. And Anton said, you need to have a masterwork that shows you're a master of the grotto, a Magister Cauverni. And he said, what would that be? And he said, well, you need some kind of work. Why don't you write something about Lovecraft? Largely because Anton was a huge collector of weird tales, and Unknown Magazine had a complete press run of weird tales down in his little basement. And so Aquino put together this very strange mixture of Lovecraftian gods and Greek arithmosophy, which was probably even more obscure to the world at that point than Lovecraft. So he came up with this angular system of magic. My good friend and sometime student, Toby Chappell, wrote a really good book on this called Infernal Geometry. And this became initially the Ceremony of the Nine Angles and the Call of Cthulhu. Now, while this was going on, there was a lady named Margaret Wendell who published a little newsletter in the Church of Satan called The Scroll of Bats. And she wrote to a guy in Chicago who's Michael Bertois, and says, hey, we're doing this Lovecraft stuff. And he said, well, I've been thinking of doing Lovecraft stuff. And then he wrote a letter to Kenneth Grant saying, this seems to be where the new aeon is about to go. And Kenneth Grant, not in a derivative sense, because he wasn't working with the same material, came to the same conclusion that these Lovecraftian ideas of great cosmic entities that basically don't give a fuck about people, that are found in places of extreme strangeness, and could bring, if you use some strangeness into your life, which is a questionable thing to do, was a great idea. And so suddenly, 1972, you got this huge burst, right, that goes off in 2 places, like 2 giant fireworks going off. Avon Books brings out the Satanic Rituals, and there at the end, there are 2 rituals that are completely Lovecraftian, the Call to Cthulhu and the Ceremony of the Nine Angles, and then a ritual based ultimately on the works of Frank Belknap Long called Dialectischen Vorspiele. Meanwhile, in Britain, Kenneth Grant is producing his occult revival. These 2 ideas hit the world from 2 different places at once, and suddenly it's a movement. And then about 3 years later, the rather sad thing, the Simon Necromonicon came into being, trying to capitalize on that movement. Although that was a rather limited piece of imagination in terms of its creation. And now it's a completely normalized thing. You'll find it in chaos magic. You'll find it in people that use satanic rituals. You'll find an entire order in the Temple of Set, who are the trapezoid, that's a major area that they play with. It was, I think, one of the first times that neo-mythology, that this idea that somebody, some like fantasy or horror writer had an idea that then became a practice so easily although that's always been going on in both the English and French and German-speaking worlds, at least.
Yeah, I think it's often overlooked, actually, that there is that sort of very strange bridge between Grant and LaVey, which is H.P. Lovecraft. I don't remember Set featuring particularly in Lovecraft's works, but he did know he was in correspondence with Robert E. Howard, and I know Robert E. Howard had invented Conan, the Conan figure, he had in his mythological world the Stygia, which is a kind of fantasized version of Egypt, and there's a lot about Set and the priests of Set and those kind of themes certainly in that work.
Oh, and so this all then was wonderful for the 70s, right? Because in the 70s we have this huge burst of sword and sorcery novels, and of course the first one to do this well, as you pointed out, was my fellow Texan, Robert E. Howard. And this is introduced to so many people. Set appeared in these novels, all sorts of things in fantasy, and then there seems to be this kind of awakening on a deeper level. This is not an unusual process in the occult. Very often you will see something show up in the most popular genre you could possibly imagine. And you think, oh, that's really shallow. But you'll then discover within a short period of time, the depths related to that shallowness show up. I always think of the human unconsciousness, the collective unconsciousness, let's say, as a vast, pretty calm ocean, but occasionally you'll see ripples up at the top. Well, that ripple up at the top means something really big is moving really deeply underneath. And certainly in the 70s and early 80s, things associated with Howard Lovecraft certainly began to show up, and we would see it in the most popular forms. There's a Call of Cthulhu role-playing game and so forth. But you would also see people considering it in a really deep way. What does this mean? What does this cosmicism mean? What does it mean to assume that maybe intelligence is something that isn't really happening on this planet? Which once you have that notion and then you watch the daily news, you realize that's true.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you mentioned earlier as well was the Order of the Trapezoid. Now, there's a Church of Satan version of this. Is there also a Temple of Set version as well then?
There is a Temple of Set version. The original version, at least according to Michael Aquino, who was in the Church of Satan at the time, Anton had originally designated that as the people running the show. And he hinted a great deal that there were several very important people who were involved who, for public reasons, couldn't say they were in the Church of Satan, which is a great piece of propaganda, right? It's like, well, we have really powerful members, but we can't tell you their names. The American Rosicrucians have done that for years, right? The Temple of Set version was founded in 1983. Michael Aquino had founded that, and it's for us, it's a knighthood, and it's a knighthood where people basically say, I am going to find a unfulfillable life quest and continue on it. And it's a way to not become lazy or too content, because if you pick a truly unfulfillable quest, you can't fulfill it, but you can work really hard. Now, Michael Aquino was the first Grand Master of the Order of the Trapezoid in the Temple of Set. The second one was Stephen Flowers. And Flowers had the completely unfulfillable quest of finding out everything about the idea of runa, the idea of secrecy in human society, particularly in Indo-European societies, mainly Germanic, although he's also written about Celtic and lately a lot about Persian societies. He'll never be able to fulfill his task, but he will always have a task to do. And I think he's doing pretty well. I mean, I've got, 5 books? He has 40. Pretty much Flowers is the winner there in the library filling aspect of occultism.
Yeah, he's certainly put a fair few out, hasn't he? I mean, I was in Watkins Books in London a couple of weeks ago, and I was staggered actually by the amount of Flowers books there were in the store.
Edred has the unique ability to see the relationship, and this also Carl has this too, but Edred has the unique ability to see the relationship between occult movement and philosophical or political stances. Now, mainly at least in the American occult world, people tend to be intellectually, have the smallest roots possible. The occult's a diversion. It's a hobby, right? It's up there with growing marigolds or something. But our ancestors understood that if you're going to get to the nature of reality, you also have an obligation to yourself and others based on what you find there. And that obligation may radically change your life. Certainly with me, when I joined the Temple of Set, I was not thinking this is going to be a lifetime endeavor. I'm a horror writer here in Austin. I thought, wow, this would be really good for my street cred. I will spend some time in a secret organization, like Arthur did in the Golden Dawn. And instead, it became a lifetime obligation because as I discovered, mainly within myself, certain principles, I then wanted to find more. So the Order of the Trapezoid remains for us a knighthood based on the idea you have to go out, you have to find things, you can never find everything you want, and you have to share what you find. So in some ways, not unlike the seekers after the Grail, although with less of a sort of pious metaphor or methodology.
Interesting. Okay, so one thing we've sort of spoken about it a lot in the past on the show, and even today in this conversation, but a lot of people, and I think maybe it's because there's so many definitions of the word. Could you give us at least a bit of a kind of history of what the phrase rather, the left-hand path actually means?
Absolutely, and to some extent, only recently has it begun to be defined. The British novelist Bulwer Lytton wanted a phrase in one of his novels to describe an evil magician. He had a magician that was 500 years old, and he was evil because he did not interact with the world. I believe his particular gesh was to never cry. So Bulwer Lytton, who was very aware of Indian spiritual techniques that were just beginning to be published in the English-speaking world, chose the phrase that will show up in all of the various religions that we gloss over with the word Hindu, Vama Marg, the path to the left, or equally good translation, the path of the woman, that involved sex, or involved dealing with substances that were impure, or involved dealing with taboo. The probably most spectacular example of a Vama Marg sect in India would be the Aghori, particularly the unreformed Aghori, who you'll occasionally see in some picture book as a naked guy covered in ashes at a cremation ground, drinking from a skull. That's your kind of basic Indian left-hand path there. Now, obviously, we aren't those guys. I'm almost never naked covered in ashes. Can't really think of a time that I was.
But the skull comes in handy now and again.
The skull comes in handy. I think skulls are a great symbol for reminding you of your mortality. But the left-hand path in the English-speaking world went through some really interesting changes. Originally, Blavatsky picked up the word and used it to describe everybody she hated. She was good, which was right-hand path, and all those other people were left-hand path. Cool. No one knew exactly what it meant. No one went and looked at what it meant in its original Sanskrit. Crowley did the same thing. I mean, here's this man that's completely outrageous and did a lot of things that were and terribly offensive to his society, from sex to drugs to a lot of other things. But he still used the term left-hand path to people he didn't like. You know, when Osmond Spare decided that he wasn't going to have sex with him, Crowley immediately wrote this thing denouncing Spare as a brother of the left-hand path. Then Anton LaVey came along, and this moment of total, absolute brilliance. He said, hey, this thing you guys all hate and are scared of, that's us. You're scared of us. We're the people you're scared of. And if you send me some money and really work hard, I'll teach you to be scary. Wow. That appeals to anybody, particularly adolescents, but it appeals to any human when they're like, I am tired of society. Now, the principles that have arisen in the left-hand path in the West turn out, shockingly, at least shocking to me, to be exactly the same as the principles of the left-hand path in India, even though there wasn't some moment where some Agori scholar came forward and said, hey, this is how you do this. Here are the basic principles. Number one, you have to make a break with your society through taboo action. You don't go to church. You have sex in a way that you're not supposed to have sex. You eat substances you're not supposed to eat. Now, obviously, that's very specific to people's culture. A young Jewish man might find his first act of rebellion to eat a ham and cheese sandwich, whereas that's not going to affect his Christian neighbor. The second principle is that most left-hand path groups, both historical ones, such as the Fraternitas Saturni, and modern ones like the Temple of Set or the Dragon Rouge, have a technology that empowers its adherents to do things beyond what's considered normal. There has to be the practice of the occult. Now, the occult, I mean that not just as magic, it's magic seen as transgressive. Magic's a lot less transgressive in English-speaking society now than it was 50 years ago. You know, we'll see the crystal shops or the herb shops or whatever. I mean, there seems to be kind of folk magic that seems alive and well and healthy, and that's a good thing. The third thing is you have to have a sense of the immortality or potential immortality of the self. You know, that you're not an illusion. You're not, the fact I think I exist is not yet another lie that was told me. I really do exist. And the fourth part is you then have to have self-deification. Now, that does not mean that you're going to surround yourself with mirrors and walk around all day and say, oh, look at me, I'm a god. No, that wrong. It means that you will believe that any miracle that has to happen in the world, any change you want to bring about that is beyond cause and effect, you've got to be responsible for it. You have to find that in yourself. You have to develop the strengths of mind, the strengths of will, the notions of arcane wisdom of how this to happen. Now, this is a huge break from Judeo-Christian thinking. Number one, Judeo-Christian thinking says there are a lot of taboos we should have that we have just in honor of God. Now, I grew up in Texas, and in Texas, there are any number of hardline Christian groups that will tell you you will go to, you'll go to hell if you play cards or if you dance. Like you ever see like the Dirty Dancing, movie? No, that's a real thing here. Those are taboos you should break. And when you break them and realize a lightning bolt isn't going to come crashing into your room at that moment, suddenly you begin to realize there's not a cosmic watchdog that's deeply offended by things you do. It is very contrary to Judeo-Christian thinking to assume there is magic. Judeo-Christians can think, well, there's angelic magic or prayer. That's not magic. I pray and it happens, but God does it. They're saying you do it yourself. That's a very radical thing. And it's a humbling thing because most of your magic doesn't work, right? You don't look at successful magicians and say, wow, you guys all won the lottery. hopefully you should say you guys are having better lives. And if you look at any occult group and the leaders are not having at least the life they want to have, don't join the group, right? It's a simple, pragmatic test. The notion that you have an immortal soul, we do share that with the Christians. We view it as like a point of view. We take Socrates' argument for the immortality of the soul. Well, we go along the same way. We think that that's absolutely correct. And then finally, that idea that I must increase myself for the sake of my own power, for the sake of my own enlightenment, for the sake of my own pleasure, and for the sake of what I can do for my friends, family, and world, is a very left-hand path point of view. Now, currently we're going through this phase where left-hand path is a popular term, similar to, let's say, 20, 25 years ago, when chaos magic was a popular term. And you had very smart people practicing it, and you had a lot of people who had no clue, but they liked to say it. And they could sell their own little book or newsletter or whatever about it. We're sort of having a weird left-hand path boom right now, and that too will eventually go away. And then only the more serious practitioners will remain as they always have.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to reflect about the taboo breaking aspect of the sort of the ethos of the left-hand path. I mean, my understanding of Buddhism is very limited, but I understand that there's in some versions of Buddhism, especially probably my understanding is more westernized sort of perspectives, is that they practice a thing called therapeutic blasphemy, where they rile against the if they were brought up, not even if they were brought up as a Christian, but they want to break away from that sort of mindset. And
see, there you have this wonderful moment. This goes back to the whole question of goals versus means. Any movement toward enlightenment, whether it's the self-deification of the left-hand path, or the Buddhist idea that you will eventually realize you don't have a permanent self, any movement toward enlightenment begins with, I'm going to break with society. I'm going to break with the messages I see constantly and I hear constantly. And one of the best ways to do it, first off, is not just to break with those things you don't like, but then think about things you have always considered, whatever your own sacred cows are, and see what happens if just in a playful way you reject that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, by the same, if you apply the same consistent reasoning to the someone converting to Buddhism and a step away from Christianity is this sort of intentional therapeutic blasphemy, as it's called. I mean, that would be equally true for somebody who was brought up as in a Buddhist or in a Buddhist part of the world and converted to Christianity. They would have to do it the other way around, or it would apply to other ideologies like political ideologies and so on. And curiously enough, actually, if lots of those, whistling on a Sabbath is, being sort of forbidden, and in certain monasteries they had like whole lists of rules. For example, I was reading one not that long ago about it was forbidden to throw snowballs, ride a horse, to swim, and a whole load of rafter stuff, which has nothing to do with Christianity. Whatever they're preaching, whatever this worldview they're presenting, is not Christianity. And I think for some people, historically, breaking from the groupthink, the mind of society, was to actually go dig deep into back into the sort of heart of Christianity, strangely enough, like a Blake, or reinvent it, renew it, like a Blake, or St. Francis of Assisi, for example. He was a Christian, but there wasn't anyone exactly like him as a Christian. He sort of renewed it he took his own path.
Well, I mean, ultimately, regardless of where you fall on the spiritual spectrum, you can take this basic word we use, religion, nice Latin roots, religio, to tie back. What are you tying back to? You're tying back to a source And that doesn't mean I'm going to take the things my minister said or the last book I read said. I have to find what the source is and tie myself to it. I have to find where things come from. And so you do have these in any faith or any philosophy or any political group. You'll have these people that come along and say, hey, we need to look at our roots. And what they do seems really strange. But, again, in just following English etymology, the word radical means going back to roots, from Latin radix. So, we have these kind of radicals from time to time in any group that come in, that change, that innovate. I would say in the left-hand path, we assume that everyone must find their own path toward a certain radicalism. They have to find out the roots of their very selves, which is why it will tend to be a much smaller movement than the right-hand path, who suggests that the roots are probably well known and probably someplace in a tradition you can work with. Although, of course, the innovators are occasionally welcome.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, it might be worth quickly as well, just sort of defining what the right-hand path is, so we can, because I think that will help us move into talking about your book a little bit as well, because the Book of the Law certainly seems to cross across right and left-hand paths, if we take what you said before into account. So could we very quickly touch on what you consider the right-hand path to be?
Just as the left-hand path is the path of isolation, the breaking away of the universe, the right-hand path is the path of union, of taking the self and making it ultimately harmonious with either something much bigger in the form of God or in the form of nature, the form of the Tao, so that one has a joyous, almost ecstatic erasure of self. One becomes a selfless being. As a consequence, the right-hand path, and most humans are on any path. Most humans have really no ideas because they don't have enough time in their lives to think of spiritualism or philosophy or anything. But as a consequence, the right-hand path is often used by political groups that want to be oppressive. Let's look at traditional Leninist communism, right? You would not think, first off, you would think, well, that's not a spiritual path. Yeah, of course it is, because the average person is supposed to ultimately erase himself for the common good, which is the will of the worker. So you're giving yourself to this greater thing. Now, in practice, this really sort of beautiful idea comes down to the people who are then saying what the will of the workers are doing pretty well, and the rest of people aren't doing so well. In America, where we have not only capitalism, but turbo-capitalism, people say, well, I do everything I can for the economy, which is even a scarier idea than the state. And then they see, various injustices, but they accept it because they're told somehow this makes everything work better. We're having this really funny moment in America right now. Last quarter, the last 3 months, oil companies in America made record profits. They're making more money on gasoline here than they have ever made. The moment the idea came that we're shutting off Russian oil, which is not that big a part of what Americans consume, suddenly prices almost doubled. So these people that were making 50% profits, which is an amazing amount, are suddenly making 80% profits, even though they're paying more. And all Americans are like, somehow we're helping the Ukraine. No, you're helping the oil companies, and the Ukraine absolutely needs your help. I mean, that's a totally wonderful and noble cause. But people are willing to sacrifice themselves for this. So the right-hand path is a path of sacrifice and union, either in its most noble forms, you might think of like Trappist monks or something, or in its least noble forms.
Yeah, it's interesting. So where does Aleister Crowley lie when it comes to the Temple of Set? Like, what's the TOS's kind of take on Crowley and Thelema?
Thelema, the idea of you finding your true will, is an absolutely, completely resonant notion throughout the temple set, and we think of Crowley as a forebearer. The mechanisms of Thelema, which are ritual magic, drug use, sex magic, we reject drug use because we don't think that brings reliable information. We don't think that, what you eat a cactus or something and see something, we don't think that's necessarily a spiritual truth. We think that's more of a chemical reaction. The ritual magic we like, sex magic is very personal. You can't define sex magic for people because people have to find their own sexuality as well as everything else in this world. Crowley, in his writings, wavered between the notion that the self is real and permanent and should be empowered, and that the self is in some way an illusion. And his own place, that this was toughest for him to figure out, was the gap he saw from his adept grades up to the master of the temple. He wanted to see the master of the temple as someone who was essentially selfless. Yet if we look at Crowley's life, he's not living like a monk giving all his things away at any point after taking the grade of master of the temple. He's still not above, taking money from followers, getting in the pants of every man and woman that he meets, consuming, drugs whenever he can. So I think what Crowley was trying to say, and what I argue in the book, is he talks about giving up the temporary self, the self that is the product of society, our social selves. And I think that, several people in Temple agree with me. Now, of course, the biggest problem in talking to someone like me, the Temple of Set doesn't have dogma. So you think, oh, here's this guy, he used to be high priest, he's well thought of there, what he's putting out is dogma. At best, I'm putting out stuff that a lot of people think. And I could easily just have someone say, no, you're wrong, I don't think that. Okay, cool. That does not affect your standing. Crowley is essential, not just for Setian thinking, but for understanding any change in the occult world, in the English-speaking occult world anyway, after the 1970s. Because the force of his philosophy, which is much more coherent than almost any writer of the occult, has seeped into everyone's thinking. As a consequence, he's actually worthwhile studying as a worldly philosopher, although I doubt we'll be seeing much of that in college campuses, at least for a couple of decades.
Yeah, that would be something, wouldn't it?
Just sort of stepping back there on the issue of the sort of magical perspective on the self, for what it's worth, my tendency is always to think of the self as basically a tool, like the hand, and the ego or the persona as being like the thumb. If you just tried to go through life using your thumb and nothing else, you wouldn't get very much done. The thumb's an amazing thing. It's but the fact we got prehensile thumbs is why our ancestors could use tools. And so, when the thumb is employed with the rest of the fingers, in the rest of the parts of the self, that's when it's the really the most effective. And I suppose the extreme forms of paths or which claim to completely negate the self or are ones which chop the thumb off. And I suppose the other one is a bit like stepping back from the ego, because in sort of classical psychological terms, the ego and the self is not the same. Persona in Jungianism is not the same. Persona means mask. So or like an actor on the stage, it's a bit like an actor is on the stage playing a role, but they're actually at some point they've forgotten they're in a play. And they're reading somebody else's script, and they're not necessarily playing, the Duke of Burgundy or whoever it might happen to be.
Well, and even taking that metaphor, just stretching that a bit, they often may find themselves in roles they should have never taken.
Yeah. Badly
because
cast.
that's not,
Yeah.
and they don't have the authenticity in that role.
Yeah.
But of course, then that begins to get into the inequality of human beings, which is a frightening concept. But we're all not going to be Hamlet, who himself, of course, obviously has some problems finding himself. But we can at least hope that we're not starring in Sharknado.
Yeah, like Oscar Wilde said, all the world is a stage, but sometimes it's very badly cast.
But yeah, Wilde is so wonderful. He's a perfect example, right? Because since he is an outsider, a double outsider in English society. First, because he's gay, and secondly, because he's Irish. Then he could see things really clearly. I mean, the one great benefit of breaking from society is you can see things really clearly. However, the great and most painful thing of breaking with society is that you can see things really clearly. You're like, oh man, I'm watching a train wreck here. I wish I couldn't understand this now.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised to hear you sort of praise Crowley. Often when you hear interviews of Satanists or left hand path practitioners, they tend to sort of poo-poo Crowley quite a lot. It's almost like a badge of honor in a way. They tend to it's almost it feels almost like they're sort of dog whistling in a sense, like Crowley's a bit of a dirty word. Why do you think that is? It doesn't seem to be with Temple of Set, but it is with for example, ONA and who else did I see? I saw another interview recently with another Left Hand Path group, and again, Crowley was like a dirty word there. Why do you think that is?
Well, I got a strong opinion on that. One of the things that Anton LaVey did when he wrote the Satanic Bible and the majority of the stuff he wrote in the Cloven newsletter is he would often, and this is a standard thing in the occult, he did not start this, he's by no means the only person, is he either claimed to have invented everything, I invented this thing, this is mine, or he made fun of the people who in fact he was ripping off. So if you read the Satanic Bible, there's a whole section on how to do magic. It is in fact a very pragmatic, let's get rid of the stuff we don't need version of Crowley's book, Magic. Step by step. It's really clear that he had that open when he was writing it, or more likely when Diane Haggerty was typing it. And then he just said, well, Crowley, he's a drug addict, and Anton was very uncomfortable around homosexuals, although he was a great believer in, sexual freedom as an idea. And so then Crowley becomes an easy whipping dog. Don't go look at that guy. He's awful. All he did was he showed it's important to be wicked. You get press. Well, Anton did that part well. And then a lot of people, continue to repeat this. For example, one of the things that Anton LaVey railed against during most of his life was Wicca. Oh, these people, they're taking they're playing the devil's game, but they're not taking the devil's name. We hate them. As opposed to saying, maybe we should form some alliance here against, the forces of society. And then you'll have any number of people who read the Satanic Bible and whose thoughts have not really gone anywhere because they're thinking Anton's thoughts, will say how awful Wiccans are. Oh, they're all fluffy bunnies. Really? Man, I've seen some of those women be incredibly politically organized and get real change in the world, and you're living in your dad's basement. But that's an unfortunate thing. Since we are a subculture, we tend to treat other similar subcultures as, wow, maybe there's something wrong with them. It's a childish thing. We may outgrow it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of self-evident, really, that Crowley's important. I mean, I think not barely a show of this, an episode rather of this show goes past without him coming up, and you can find his books quite freely. Well, you can these days, and he's you know, he's an incredibly quoted person, so that he obviously did something right. That's kind of always been my my take on it. You know,
yeah, I mean, people are quoting Crowley even when they don't realise they're doing it. His influence is so ubiquitous. But I think for people who resonate with Crowley's work and ideas, and find it a useful or an engaging path, that's one thing. I think they tend to have one kind of relationship with him. But I think if you want to follow a path of some sort, I suppose for some people he's like an obstacle on that path, because it's like this huge beast, pun intended, is sort of in the way, because how do you then get around it? You can't go over the mountain, you have to go around the mountain. But in a way, what you need to do really is just like acknowledge his influence and then and build on that, I would have thought. But who am I to say?
Well, there's a major problem, and I think you're quite correct, which is people have a lot of problem with limits. So if I'm going to pick up this book and read it, I have to know some limits about what do I think, who am I, which you can question all the time. You can check your limits, but there are people who, when they find any thinker that begins to open a universe for them, there's that tendency to think, well, this is the guy or the gal. I'm going to do everything based on that. So you'll find people who in the satanic milieu who have read the Satanic Bible, who then shave their head and try to look like Anton. Man, this is just it's sad. Or you can find I've known Gurdjieffians, right, who shave their head and try to have like an accent when they're talking. And I'm like, dude, you're from America. Why are you trying to sound like you're Russian? And besides, he was a Georgian. Or again with Crowley, you don't have to do what the guru taught. You have to understand what the guru taught in context. You're not going to get any closer to your true will by shooting up heroin. You're just going to get a heroin addiction.
Yeah, that's true. So, what was the kind of the inspiration? What kind of what made you want to write a book like this one, Overthrowing the Old Gods?
Well, it began initially. In fact, I wasn't that interested in Crowley at first. But around 2004, 2005, about 100 years after the reception of the Book of the Law, there was just a lot of chatter about that on Setian email lists. People were talking about these things. And I began to respond to some of the things, and this is basically the last section of the book, The Fire and the Force, is where this comes from, where it went to. I started writing really short essays. And initially I just said, okay, I'm going to write 11 essays. Because, of course, according to Crowley, 11 is the number of magic, it's the number of change, it's the letter K, has all these, wonderful properties for him. And that didn't say enough. And I said, okay, so I've written 11, which corresponds to fire. I'm going to write 20 more essays corresponding to force, because he decided that his formula was fire and force. And so I wrote 20 more essays. And I sent those kind of out in the world, and then I discovered that people had copied them and shared them in other forums, and I was seeing them quoted, and I thought, there's some real interest here. I should probably maybe write another book. And then before I did this, I've been read and read and read and read more, and talked to a lot of practitioners of various branches of Thelema, and said, I think this would be a legitimate book. And so I wanted to do this in the most taboo breaking way I could that wouldn't get my head shot. So I decided I would do a commentary on the Book of the Law, because that is forbidden. That is expressly forbidden. So, okay, I'm going to do that. Now, years before, Dr. Quino had written his own commentary. And for many years, his belief is that writing should not be shared with the great unwashed. You should share your writings with just initiates. And he and I had a significant disagreement on that over the years. I said, look, the reason people say the Temple of Set does all these weird, crazy things is because there's literally nothing they can go to the library and read about. I said, we can just say, here's what we do. If you like it, here's our address, right? So I had begun writing books for the public, like Uncle Setnock's Essential Guide. And as I was writing this, I wrote him saying, hey, can I quote from your commentary on the Book of the Law? And to my utter surprise, he said you could publish it if you wanted. And so that gave the book a really odd shape because it's my commentary than his commentary. I thought that's amazing. That's going to actually show that people can have ideas and thought about the Book of the Law and not be part of the OTO or an AA lineage or the Trinitas Saturni or some new OTO would-be group.
Yeah, and it's very refreshing actually seeing a different perspective on that material, that core material.
And much to my surprise, because I assumed I would simply be shunned as a center of abomination and disease and pestilence, right? That's Crowley's phrase, people do commentaries. I have been invited by a couple of OTO groups to come in and just talk and do seminars. So a lot of his current followers are much more open-minded than maybe some of the more traditionalists. To the extent you can be traditional about something that just started last century.
That's quite refreshing, actually, to hear, because we often, Mark and I talk about this a lot. We often think that groups like the OTO or other similar groups, there's this move to kind of clutch onto the older ways, I suppose. But we're really for these kinds of traditions to survive, they need to adapt and modernize and really look at the world around them and figure out how to interact with that world.
Well, I think that's the important truth to any degree of initiation, is that you shouldn't join a group where they've already picked one person and say, well, that's the high watermark. It's never going to get better. I can look at any fourth way group in the world, from some that are the best to some that are just almost like Gurdjieff worshippers. But if you even suggest, well, will there ever be another teacher that can do this? People will look at you in shocked silence. You've blasphemed in some way. As long as you always think there can't be someone better than, that there is a top dog, then it's a group that can't live. Now, in the Temple of Set, you would not find someone that wouldn't have anything other than admiration for Michael Aquino. But you would also say, other people in the temple have held his rank of initiation, and we expect this will continue. And maybe with my own work, I can get there. We shouldn't take our teachers and make them inaccessible. We should take our teachers and say, wow, this teaching is really good. The best way I can honor it is to transform myself into an effective, potent, powerful person, and then bring new fire to the world. Although the Book of the Law also suggests that that's possible. In one of those sections that doesn't get quoted a lot.
Yeah. So we've discussed the left and right hand path a bit, and obviously I understand this is a bit of a broad question, but how does the Book of the Law in your analysis of it kind of relate to the left and right hand path?
I find the Book of the Law to be significant in the following ways. Number one, I think it's really important that Crowley did not offer a mystical system that is plugged into an existing system. That is amazing. We could look at every Christian mystic from year 33 to year 2022, and they plug their stuff into an existing system. He has a system that does not privilege the East or the West, that doesn't privilege if you read German idealism or you've never read philosophy at all. And he had it at the center of the world, because Cairo is the center of the world. He returned to the notion that there was something in Egyptian thought that's a thing of value. And the Egyptians are largely the people that did the best job of incorporating magic into their philosophy. They didn't see it as aberrant, they didn't see it as childish, they didn't see it as simply a way to serve the gods. Crowley also, the Book of the Law, does not point out any gender or any gender orientation or any kind of sexuality as being more important. It does not state that men or women are more important. Now, some fundamental groups have some thought on that, but the Book of the Law doesn't. And what's important, the test above tests here, is this action, which was 3 days of receiving something, which he even lost the Book of the Law for about 2 years. Just found it one day when he was getting ready to go on a skiing trip, produced such a huge effect, not only in him, but in everyone that it touches. The test is a pragmatic test. Anybody can channel a text. There are some New Age groups here in Austin. They get channel texts every week on a reliable schedule. I think it's, Friday night about 8 o'clock. The people from, some star group contact them. It doesn't change anybody. The Book of the Law does actually produce change. And you will meet people who read it and are like, I don't even know what this is about, but man, I got to find out something more. It has that slice of true otherness, that moment of the spiritual that is not tied down to the workaday world. And as a consequence, everything that came afterward is different. Even though Crowley didn't work out his theories of aeons and so on and so forth, then much later, it's like this moment where, everything's going to happen differently. And the last, I could several, but the last reason the Book of the Law is tremendously interesting is what was going on in Crowley's life. Crowley had decided to stop being a wastrel. He had married. He was going to go back to England and settle down. He had achieved the highest grade he could in the Golden Dawn. He had had his whole little occult adventure. And what does he do? For his sweetheart, for his wife, on spring equinox, she says, I want to see some magic. He takes her to the Great Pyramid. He invokes sylphs, and she sees stuff. She actually has an experience. And this moment was someone who achieved magic, who had not gone through Golden Dawn training, and who was not interested in magic, and who had not given them their lives to magic, but just going to this very unusual place that's very much the center of the world in all kinds of ways, and has this experience. This shows that there's something going on here that's far beyond the average magical experience, even the average channeling experience, shall we say. So the Book of the Law really does stand out. Did the Book of the Law save Crowley? Probably not. But it really kept him damn well amused, and maybe that was his salvation. It certainly saved him from having a middle-class life. He then didn't go back to Britain and fit in. His life got more and more daring and erratic, and somehow managed to stay out of jail, which is kind of amazing. So the Book of the Law has a transformative effect if you are ready, and if you are willing, and then if you test the results, it's a good text.
So one of the things you talk about in the book is this Loki archetype. I was wondering if you could talk to that a bit.
Lord Loki. He was doing pretty well these days, right? Didn't he just recently have a television series?
Yeah, TV, on
Loki, for years, it was assumed in most scholarly circles, his name was connected with the word lok, with fire. There was a brilliant dissertation a few years back, a don't remember the name of the person. I can probably find it and email it to you. Who discovered the name means the ender. He stops things. Loki comes along and breaks things at a very particular moment. Now, this is something that we don't like in our lives. We don't actually like when catastrophe happens. But when catastrophe happens, it tests us, it gives us new tools, it changes everything. And the Loki archetype is this figure, this trickster, usually outside ourselves, who at some moment appears and totally disrupts our lives. And then we can decide, do I want to go back to the old normal, or am I going to create a new world? Now, what is most frightening and to some extent exciting about the world right now is now billions of people have experienced the Loki archetype because their lives have been entirely disrupted. Most people are going to try to go back to the old normal, but will never get back to the old normal. When you crack something open, it gets bigger, and that's Loki's job.
Interesting. So, and how does this how do you apply this within the book to the Book of the Law? Where do you see that kind of connection point?
Crowley sought out the chaotic Loki moment. He actually came to a place where he says, I've done everything I can do initiatorily. I've got my life planned out. Man, I've got a fortune. I'm going to go up to Scotland. I'm going to be, old Scottish laird. Got my wife. It's all great. My little house on Loch Ness. And he then says, but is there something more? And the universe, in the form of Awise, or in the form of Set, or in the form of however you want to describe the voice that spoke to him, even if you say it's a voice from within him, said, yes, here's something more. And it's so strange looking, you don't get it. But we're going to fill this with so much mystery, you will seek it out. And the rest of his life is seeking that mystery. Loki comes to all of us. To those of us that are brave and prepared, we can go with whatever hints he drops. Now, Crowley did not, of course, identify his speaker with Loki because he, is a person of the Southern tradition. If he had been some kind of Northerner, he probably would have thought of Loki, or maybe Odin in one of his more evil forms, like Bolverker. The trickster will come to us. It will come to everybody that will hear this. It will come to everybody that's listening to something else when this is on. But very few people are brave enough to say, wow, I'm going to follow the clues that he left.
And just one thing I must ask you about, because I know that you've got, I know you will have, I know you do have thoughts about this, is the Set creature. What, because the Egyptians, they, the animal that Set is supposed to represent, it's always been very mysterious, which is part of actually which as a level of mystique to him, actually, I always felt. And the Egyptians, they don't tend to, if they have sort of fantastical creatures, chimeras, they're a chop suey of sort of established animals, aren't they? Like, the head of a crocodile and the forepaws of a leopard and the hind parts of a hippopotamus or something like that. But the Set creature seems to sort of almost been sort of created out of complete cloth in that respect, and there's speculation exactly what it was meant to represent. I just wondered what, Mr. Webb, you think on that.
Well, several Egyptological scholars, this is not just me spouting my own observations, note that, of course, the Egyptians explained everything through natural metaphor when they could. The sun is like the hawk. He's up above. He circles around. He sees everything. Or the sun is like the beetle coming out of the mound, rolling the ball. Set seems to be a completely fantastic creature, and seems to be, even for the Egyptians, up till late antiquity, to be the symbol of stuff that stands outside of reality, that stands outside of the ordered zones. Set then becomes in charge of the starry heavens at night as opposed to the well-ordered sun. He's in charge of storm. He's in charge of the desert lands where no one travels. His wives, some of his wives are foreign goddesses like Anath and Asarte. And so that image seems to be the symbol for everything beyond. Now, by Greek and Roman times, the Greeks wanted to say one of your names for Set, which is Ia, is very similar to the sound that a donkey makes. So we think that the animal is probably a donkey, which of course was a little weird because the Egyptians at that time didn't have donkeys. We're like, okay, sure, whatever. So it becomes, by the time of the early Roman Empire, it's the ass-headed god. But the original Set beast is incredibly mysterious. And in any of the great Egyptological studies, such as Tabelda's Seth, the god of confusion, there's a lot of pages suggesting maybe they knew that it was chosen because it does stand for that which is outside of the ordered world. It's that alienness that can break in.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some speculation that it might represent a sort of tapir, and Egypt's part of Africa, isn't it? Just about. I mean, it's on the outer.
Well, there have been various animals chosen. The giraffe was one. The Egyptian morimur, which is an electric catfish, which looks like the head of Set, and pretty strange. You see a fish, touch it, and it shocks you. That stands out. It's pretty weird. There was, from time to time, an animal shows up in Egypt, hasn't, in fact, showed up even this century in the little town of Ombos, called the Salwa, which is the Egyptian werewolf that looks like Set. But no one was able to catch a Salwa during its latest appearance, although a lot of cryptozoologists were like, well, this looks just like this ancient Set god. Okay, well, what's the next step here? We don't know, but it's really cool. I tend to go for the fact it's a fantastic beast, but probably barring a time machine that lets me go back to pre-dynastic Egypt, I'm never going to know.
Yeah. I mean, Anubis for a considerable amount of time was regarded as a jackal, but I think the current thought, for what it's worth, is that he was a species of Egyptian wolf, which I think was only just recently discovered, that there was such a creature in the first place. So who knows? Maybe out there somewhere in that desert are the bones of some Set type creature. Who knows? That might come to light at some point.
Well, it's funny you say the bones, because there was a historic temple of Set that actually had a collection of odd bones, and it turned out to be fossilized dinosaur bones, because they had found some of these things in the desert and said, well, this Set has something to do with this. Look how weird it is. So there were Egyptological collections that would have these black, large bones, and were very disturbing to people kind of in the early parts of Egyptology, because basically there was no idea what the hell the things were. But Set has always had this connection with the weird. For example, Set's metal is meteoritic iron, the Ba in Pet, the metal from heaven. And even among, say, the relics of the king Tutankhamun, he had a dagger made out of meteoritic iron and a giant chest jewel carved in the shape of a Kefra beetle made from meteoritic glass. Anything that burst into the world was in some way connected with the magical, and usually, ultimately, with Set.
Yeah, it's interesting. So talking, going from, I think we'll close out with this as well. On this interview, on the back of the book, something I think will grab the attention of people. There's a talk of another beast, which is the first beast of Revelation, and your apparent self-identification with this entity. Could you talk to that? And what is your relationship with the first beast of Revelation?
I only do that sometimes when I'm on a Christian radio show. Because it guarantees people get extremely angry. The notion, however, from the probably mushroom-induced trip of John Patmos was the idea that there was something that would come and challenge Christianity, and it would come in the form of these two beasts. And then Crowley identified himself with the first beast, and then at one point, Aquino had identified himself with the second beast. It's really, really good for annoying the hell out of people. In terms of, do I think that that's a particularly useful metaphor? Maybe only at the beginning of initiation when you are breaking your ties with your Judeo-Christian roots. The notion, though, particularly Crowley did it the best, of being a great beast, in other words, you're living outside the law of man, is a powerful notion. And the notion that the great beast also has powers of prophecy, it can speak the future into being, that's very frightening to the establishment. So these are fun things to play with, but one should never confuse one's Lego helicopter with a real helicopter.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you giving us so much of your time. Could you perhaps tell us where, if people want to find you online, where would the best place be?
Well, I hang out a great deal on Facebook as Don Webb, and I will accept messages. Also, writing me care of my publisher, Inner Traditions. They have a link for author, and that will be sent directly to me. And I'm probably going to be, in a short period of time, I'm going to be coming out with some new books. So I'm also be doing a lot of podcasts. So I think I'll be pretty visible.
Excellent. So hopefully if you have new books, we'll have you back on the show to talk about them. Okay, can you tell us anything about the new books?
The book I'm working on the book that's about to be published, opposed to what I'm working on right now, is called How to Be a Modern Mage. And it's a 12-month training guide to teach people, right-hand path, left-hand path, whomever, how to be a successful magician. I decided to, as opposed to sending people to the same old, tired training books, I thought, wow, we have learned a lot in the last 100 years. Let me put this together. So I created my own training book, and I think it's going to have a huge effect. In the best, over the long run, it's as good as Crowley's magic as far as bringing some new thought and technology to the occult world.
Excellent. That sounds great. Well, thanks anyway. It was fantastic to have you on, and like I said, when that book comes out, we'll certainly have you back on.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Webb, for sharing some of the mysteries and intriguing concepts in the Temple of Set. Very much appreciated.
And we're back. So how did that go with you, Mr. Satyr?
I very much appreciated Mr. Webb's time and shedding and sharing that his sort of insights into that the Temple of Set, because that is something I really do not know a great deal about at all. So I feel I've come a little bit closer to that. So yes, and the sort of the and also the Egyptian mysteries. I mean, we do touch on that, and its relationship also with other things like Thelema and there's a whole host of things you could talk about. I mean, yes, and
yeah, I said it in the intro, but it's always interesting. I mean, with the Book of the Law, I mean, this is something we've looked at many times on the show over the years. Crowley and Thelema and the Book of the Law. So it's always interesting to see that kind of thing looked at from a different perspective, isn't it? It's
throws a different light on it. Yeah, so.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, so we will be back soon, next week, I hope. But if you want to stay in touch with us, do look us up on Instagrams at SittingNow. We're on Facebook. Like I said in a previous episode, I'm still looking into ways of kind of navigating that a little bit better. And of course, you can find us on Twitter at SittingNow and on YouTube at SittingNow, where I promise we do have some videos coming soon. And of course, you can listen to the shows there as well. But until next time, we'll see you soon.
Smerdon.